This is their primary training ground.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a spectacle! Give it up for the Space Invaders!
They scanned the readings from orbit and saw 200 vehicles deliberately colliding with each other inside a fenced dirt bowl while thousands of humans cheered, and concluded, with total confidence, that they had stumbled onto a controlled military exercise, possibly a live-fire training ground, definitely something worth landing in the middle of to gather intelligence. What they had actually found was the county fairgrounds Saturday night demolition derby, 40 minutes before the main event, and quite possibly the single worst place in the galaxy to land a reconnaissance shuttle without an appointment. If you like watching an overconfident empire get folded into a scrap heap, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment telling me the worst car you've ever owned. Now let's get into it, because in about 30 seconds, the Korathi expansion fleet is going to learn exactly what "run what ya brung" means. Vice Marshal Alec Dre had studied 900 worlds before this one, and every survey report loaded into his tactical display told him some version of the same reassuring story. Humans, when confronted with an unfamiliar and superior force, either scattered or froze in place, buying his advanced teams the critical window they needed to establish control before any organized response could form. His scanning officer, a lean, precise creature named Puvesh, floated a data slate in front of him showing an aerial capture of a dirt oval ringed by grandstands, floodlights, and a churned, muddy infield already scarred with tire tracks and the wrecks of vehicles that had, evidently, been crashing into one another on purpose. Target selected, Marshal, a rural gathering site, vehicles engaged in what our behavioral models are calling coordinated mutual destruction. Puvesh tapped the slate, and the image rotated to show the packed grandstand, a sea of humans in lawn chairs and folding bleachers, funnel cake in hand, cheering every impact. Population estimate 4,000. No visible military presence. No organized defense structure. The vehicles themselves appear improvised, stripped interiors, welded doors, numbers painted directly onto the hoods in a manner consistent with amateur, unregulated construction. Alec narrowed both of his eyes with something close to satisfaction. 900 worlds had taught him that an unregulated crowd built around chaos for entertainment was, by every metric his species had ever used to judge a target, the softest kind of population there was: undisciplined, unarmed, and already primed to treat anything unexpected as spectacle rather than threat. An arena, then. Improvised vehicles, no formal command structure, a crowd trained to expect violence as entertainment rather than danger. He allowed himself a rare note of anticipation. This will make an excellent staging ground. Land the shuttle in the central field. We will use the open ground as a forward operating position while we assess the surrounding territory. Puvesh hesitated before closing the channel, running one final check on a detail that had flagged as low priority but nagged at him regardless. Marshal, there is one additional data point. Audio analysis of the crowd suggests a recurring vocalization pattern, high volume, repeated at irregular intervals throughout the recorded footage. Our translators render it as a single phrase. Send it. Meaning? Unclear, Marshal. Context suggests encouragement, though toward what specifically, we cannot yet determine. Alec dismissed this the way he dismissed most linguistic anomalies flagged by junior officers, filing it under the broad category of civilian noise that had never once, across 900 worlds, turned out to matter tactically. What none of Alec's scans could measure, and what "send it" would come to mean by the end of the evening, was the actual internal culture of a Saturday night demolition derby 40 minutes before the feature event, when the pit area behind the grandstand was already packed with drivers doing last-minute reinforcement welds on cars that had, in most cases, been purchased for less than the price of a decent television. When the announcer's booth had already run through 6 hours of commentary and had developed a specific, practiced cadence for describing chaos as it happened. And when the crowd itself, having paid $12 a head to watch cars get destroyed on purpose, had arrived at a collective state of mind in which nothing that entered that dirt oval was capable of surprising them, because surprise was, structurally speaking, the entire point of the evening. What none of Ellick's scans could measure was the actual internal culture of a Saturday night demolition derby 40 minutes before the feature event, when the pit area behind the grandstand was already packed with drivers doing last-minute reinforcement welds on cars that had, in most cases, been purchased for less thought. And the price of a decent television, when the announcer's booth had already run through 6 hours of commentary and had developed a specific, practiced cadence for describing chaos as it happened, and when the crowd itself, having paid $12 a head to watch cars get destroyed on purpose, had arrived at a collective state of mind in which nothing that entered that dirt oval was capable of surprising them, because surprise was, structurally speaking, the entire point of the evening. The shuttle came down just after 8 in the evening, low and fast, cutting across the infield in a wash of pale blue light that the announcer, a wiry man in his 60s named Chuck Doss who had called derbies at this fairground for 31 years, spotted from the booth roughly 4 seconds before it touched down. "Well, folks, I don't know what that is, but it just landed in turn 2, and if the Peterson boys don't hit it in the next 30 seconds, I'll eat my hat," Chuck said into the microphone, in exactly the same tone he used to announce a flat tire or a stalled engine, because in 31 years of calling derbies, Chuck had developed a professional commitment to narrating whatever happened in that ring without ever once breaking stride, on the theory that the crowd had paid for continuous commentary, and Chuck intended to deliver it regardless of what showed up. The Korathi shuttle's ramp lowered. 6 soldiers under squad leader Torvin Kess stepped out onto churned mud, weapons raised, expecting to find themselves in open, undefended terrain suitable for establishing a forward position. They found themselves standing in the middle of an active demolition derby heat, 30 seconds before the 5-minute mark, directly in the path of 11 vehicles that had spent the last 90 seconds locating and eliminating targets with the specific, practiced aggression of drivers who had been waiting all week for exactly this. Torvin's translator activated. "This territory is now under Korathi authority. Remain." He did not finish the sentence, because a heavily modified 1987 sedan driven by a woman named Denny Vasco, 44 years old, 3rd season on the demolition circuit, number 22 painted in white shoe polish across a hood the color of rust and old paint, hit him broadside at 19 miles an hour. It should be said, in fairness to Denny, that she had not aimed for Torvin specifically. She had aimed for the general area where a competitor's car had been sitting 8 seconds earlier, a car that had since reversed out of the collision zone, leaving Torvin standing precisely where the front bumper of car number 22 arrived exactly on schedule. Denny felt the impact, checked her mirror out of habit, saw something large and gray and armored bounce off her hood and roll into the mud, assumed it was a stray piece of someone else's car door, and immediately pivoted to look for her next target, because in a demolition derby you did not stop for debris, you drove through it. In the stands above, a local newspaper photographer named Marion Cade, on assignment to cover the derby for the fairground's weekly community insert, had her long lens trained on turn 2 at the exact moment the shuttle touched down, purely by accident, because she'd been trying to catch a wide shot of the crowd reaction to Heat 5. She fired off 11 frames in 6 seconds without fully registering what she was photographing, more focused on getting the exposure right against the floodlights than on the actual contents of the frame, and moved on to the next heat without a second thought, the way a photographer on a tight weekly deadline usually did. The photos would run 2 days later on page 14, captioned, at the editor's insistence, "Derby drama in turn 2. Even the promo stunts got wrecked. filed under local color rather than news, and never once flagged by anyone at the paper as anything other than an unusually elaborate sponsor gimmick that hadn't gone according to plan. Chuck, watching from the booth, leaned into the microphone. And Denny Vasco in the 22 car just cleared what looked like some kind of promotional stunt right off the top of turn 2, folks. I don't know if that's part of tonight's show or if somebody's insurance company is about to have a very bad Monday, but either way, that's a solid hit. The remaining 5 soldiers, watching their squad leader get struck and rolled by a moving vehicle without ever firing a shot, did the only thing their training offered no clear guidance for. They scattered, not in retreat, but simply trying to find open ground in a ring that had no open ground left, because 11 cars were still actively pursuing each other across every available square foot of the infield. Vice Marshal Ellick, watching the feed from orbit, felt something he had not felt across 900 conquered worlds, which was the specific, cold confusion of watching his advance team engage a target and immediately. Why get physically absorbed by the terrain itself? Report, he said. Puvesh cross-checked the sensor data twice before answering, because the readings kept insisting on something his translation matrix flagged as statistically implausible. Marshal, squad leader Torvin has sustained an impact from one of the ground vehicles. He is mobile, but disoriented. The remaining team members are attempting to relocate to open terrain, but the vehicles do not appear to be avoiding them. They are attacking directly. Unclear, Marshal. The vehicle's movement patterns do not correlate with our soldiers' positions specifically. They appear to be pursuing each other, and our team is simply in the path of that pursuit. Ellick pressed 2 fingers to the ridge above his brow, a gesture his officers had learned to read as the calm before something considerably worse. Then instruct the team to hold position and demonstrate authority. A show of force should clear the immediate area. This instruction reached the ground roughly 4 seconds before a car driven by a 19-year-old named Cody Bratcher, competing in his very first derby after 3 years of begging his father for a car to wreck, spotted a stationary target near turn 3, and with the specific enthusiasm of a rookie who had not yet developed the caution that came with experience, drove directly at it at full throttle. The stationary target was a soldier named Rel, who had been ordered to hold position and was, in fact, holding position exactly as instructed, weapon raised, doing his level best to project the kind of unshakable authority that had subdued 3 separate civilizations under Ellick's command. Cody's car hit him at 22 miles an hour, sent him tumbling across the hood, off the windshield, and into the mud roughly 15 feet away, and Cody, unaware he had struck anything other than a competitor's abandoned car door, let out a whoop of pure, uncomplicated joy over his radio to his pit crew, who whooped back. Chuck's voice rolled across the PA system. Oh, and young Cody Bratcher just planted one on whatever that big gray thing is out there, folks. That's a heck of a first hit for a rookie. Somebody buy that boy a funnel cake. Rel himself, once he'd finished tumbling and come to rest against the infield fence, spent nearly a full minute simply lying in the mud running a full diagnostic on his own armor, convinced some critical system must have failed to allow that much force through without triggering an alert, before finally accepting what his sensors kept insisting. Nothing had failed. He had simply been hit by a car being driven, with total sincerity, by a teenager who thought he was an inanimate obstacle. Rel had survived an orbital bombardment on his second campaign. He had never, in either case, felt quite this specific flavor of confusion. By the time the 5-minute horn sounded, and the heat came to its scheduled end, Torvin's entire advance team was scattered across the infield in various states of disoriented stillness, none of them seriously injured. The same reinforced armor plating that had protected them through 900 campaigns had, as it turned out, been more than adequate to absorb repeated low-speed impacts from vehicles built primarily out of scrap metal and stubbornness. But every single one of them, thoroughly unable to process what had just happened to their carefully planned staging ground. Track officials, a small crew of volunteers responsible for clearing the infield between heats, walked out onto the mud to check on drivers and, per standard procedure, clear any debris before the next round began. A man named Pete Willoughby, 61 years old, 22 years volunteering trackside, spotted the 6 large armored figures scattered around the infield, and did what 22 years of trackside work had trained him to do with anything unusual he found in that ring. He assumed it was somebody's promotional gimmick. "You fellas with the sponsor?" Pete asked, walking up to Torvin, who was in the process of getting back to his feet, mud caked across half his armor. "We got a car company doing some kind of mascot thing tonight. Figured that might be you. You need a hand getting off the track before the next heat. We clear in about 4 minutes." Torvin's translator processed the question with visible strain. "We are securing this territory." Sure, whatever the bid is." Pete had heard stranger promotional pitches over the years. A mattress store had once sent a man in a full foam costume to stand in the infield for an entire heat as a stunt, and he'd nearly gotten hit twice before anyone thought to escort him out. "Just can't have you out here when the next round starts. Insurance won't cover it. Come on, I'll walk you to the fence." Torvin, still processing the fact that his squad had just been physically removed from combat readiness by amateur vehicles operated for entertainment purposes, wed himself to be walked to the fence line by a 61-year-old volunteer holding a flashlight, an outcome that would later occupy several uncomfortable paragraphs in his personal after-action report. Vice Marshal Ellick watched this exchange with mounting disbelief. "They are being escorted." "It appears so, Marshal," Puvesh said carefully. "The humans seem to have classified our team as a promotional display rather than a military incursion. They are being treated with courtesy, but also with the expectation that they will vacate the area promptly." Ellick considered briefly the possibility that his scans had catastrophically misjudged the nature of the target, and decided, with the confidence of a man who had never once been wrong across 900 worlds, that this was simply an unfortunate first contact, and that a second, better-prepared team would resolve the issue. "Deploy the second squad. Secure the announcer's platform. If we control the point of communication, we control the narrative." This was, statistically, the worst possible objective available to him, because the announcer's booth that night was staffed by exactly one person, Chuck Doss, a man who had been narrating chaos into a microphone for 31 consecutive years, and had never once, in that entire career, encountered a situation his professional instincts told him required alarm rather than commentary. The second squad, 4 soldiers under an officer named Vray, climbed the exterior stairs to the announcer's platform, a rickety plywood structure perched above the grandstand, and found Chuck exactly where he always was, headset on, coffee in a thermos. 3 decades of muscle memory keeping his voice level no matter what walked through the door behind him. Vray's translator activated. "This position is under Korathi control. You will cease your broadcast and..." "Folks, we got some fellas up here in the booth now too, apparently," Chuck said into the live microphone, without so much as turning his head, because 31 years had taught him that dead air was worse than almost anything else that could happen during a broadcast, including, evidently, an armed incursion. "Costume department really went all out this year. Y'all want to say a few words for the crowd while I get Heat 6 lined up?" The crowd, hearing this over the PA system, assumed exactly what Chuck's tone had primed them to assume, and let out a ragged cheer, because a crowd that had already spent 6 hours applauding deliberate car crashes was fully prepared to applaud almost anything else that showed up, provided it was announced with enough confidence. Vray, whose translator had never once been trained to interpret applause as anything other than either surrender or celebration, hesitated for a full 3 seconds, weapon lowered slightly, trying to determine which of the two he was currently receiving. In that hesitation, Chuck reached over, without breaking his commentary rhythm, and flagged down a security volunteer stationed near the booth stairs. A retired sheriff's deputy named Hollis Grant, who had worked fairground security for 11 seasons, and had a professional habit of quietly resolving problems before they became announcements. Hollis climbed the stairs, took one look at 4 armored figures standing behind Chuck's chair, and said, in the same flat, unbothered tone he'd used on drunk fans, over-enthusiastic fathers, and one memorable incident involving a loose goat, "Fellas, booth's crew only. Gonna need you back down on the ground." "We are not crew," Vray said. "Then you especially need to be back on the ground." Hollis gestured toward the stairs with the patient, immovable authority of a man who had spent 11 seasons removing people from places they weren't supposed to be. "Chuck's got a broadcast to run. You're blocking his sightline to turn one, and I really don't want to write this up as an incident report at 8:45 on a Saturday." Vray's team retreated down the stairs without a shot fired, escorted personally by Hollis, who spent the walk down explaining, unprompted, exactly which gate they should use if they wanted general admission seating instead, because he'd assumed, not unreasonably, that whatever promotional stunt this was, the guys running it had simply gotten lost on their way to wherever they were actually supposed to be standing. At the bottom of the stairs, the team nearly collided with a woman named Fran Ostrowski, 68 years old, 31 seasons running the fairground's first aid station alongside her late husband, and since his passing, alone. Fran had come up to the booth to remind Chuck about a schedule change for the trophy presentation, and seeing 4 large armored strangers descending the stairs with an unmistakable air of having just been asked to leave somewhere, did what 31 years of patching up drivers, drunk fans, and the occasional over-enthusiastic child had trained her to do with a Nyon, who looked even slightly worse for wear. She reached out, grabbed Vray by the forearm before he could pass, and said, "Hold on, hun, let me look at you, you're walking funny." Vray's translator flagged the physical contact as an unexpected variable and offered no clear protocol for withdrawal without appearing hostile, so he simply stood still while Fran checked his balance, peered at the mud caking one side of his armor, and pronounced him probably fine, just shook up. Advice she delivered with the same brisk confidence she used on every driver who limped off the track insisting they were fine when they very clearly were not. She sent him off with a small paper packet of aspirin, for later if you need it, and turned back to her original errand without ever once questioning what, exactly, she'd just examined. Back on the ship, Alec reviewed the combined reports from both teams with the specific, grinding disbelief of a commander watching an operation collapse without a single shot having landed on his side or theirs. "Casualty report," he said. Puvesh checked the readout. "No injuries sustained, Marshal, beyond minor impact bruising to squad leader Torvin's team. Officer Vray's team has been escorted from the announcer's platform and directed toward what the humans call general admission. Neither team engaged a single armed defender at any point." "There are no armed defenders." "There do not appear to be any, Marshal. There is only the event itself, and it does not appear to distinguish between us and any other unfamiliar object that enters its space. It simply processes us according to its own internal logic, as debris to be cleared, as costume talent to be redirected, or, in squad leader Torvin's case, as an obstacle to be driven through." Alec ordered a third team down at 9:15, time to arrive during the intermission between the heats and the feature event, reasoning that a quieter moment in the program would offer his soldiers a clearer opportunity to establish a visible, uncontested presence. It was, in hindsight, the single worst-timed decision of the entire operation, because intermission at a demolition derby was not, in fact, a quiet moment. It was the pit area at its most crowded, staffed by every driver competing in the feature event, all of them making final reinforcement welds, all of them running on the specific, focused adrenaline of people about to deliberately destroy a vehicle they had spent weeks preparing, surrounded by tool chests, spare tires, and in at least 6 cases, family members holding fire extinguishers as a precaution. Meanwhile, near the concession stand behind the grandstand, a member of Torvin's original team, separated from his unit during the first heat and still disoriented from the impact, had wandered toward the nearest source of light and noise, which happened to be a funnel cake trailer run by a husband and wife team named Deb and Ray Kowalczyk, 12 years on the fairground circuit. Deb spotted the soldier standing uncertainly near the trailer's order window, armor scuffed with mud, and did what 12 years of feeding overstimulated fairground crowds had trained her to do with anyone who looked lost and slightly shaky. She assumed low blood sugar. "Honey, you look like you need something in you," Deb said, already reaching for a paper tray. "Funnel cakes fresh, powdered sugar or cinnamon on the house, you look rough." The soldier's translator processed the offer through several layers of diplomatic protocol, none of which had ever prepared him for an unsolicited gift of fried dough from a civilian vendor, and accepted it mostly because his training offered no clear guidance for refusing something handed to him with that much apparent sincerity. He held the tray, uncertain, while Deb turned to the next customer in line, and Ray, glancing over, added, "Bring the tray back when you're done. We're short on trays tonight." A request the soldier would spend the better part of an hour trying to determine whether it constituted a diplomatic obligation. The third team, 5 soldiers under an officer named Karsk, dropped in directly at the edge of the pit area, where a driver named Randy Oduya, 38 years old, competing in his 9th season, was in the middle of welding a reinforcement bar across his driver's side door when 5 armored figures materialized roughly 10 feet from his car. Randy flipped up his welding mask, looked at them for a long moment and said, "You need a hand with something, or you just here to watch the feature?" Karsk's translator processed this with visible confusion. "We are securing this facility on behalf of the Korathi expansion fleet." "Cool. You want a lawn chair or you gonna stand?" Randy had, over 9 seasons, developed a working philosophy that almost nothing happening in a Derby pit was worth stopping his weld for, a philosophy that had served him well through 3 engine fires, 1 minor explosion, and an incident involving a car that had, for reasons nobody ever fully explained, caught a raccoon mid-heat. Features in 20 minutes. If you're competing, you gotta register at the trailer. If you're not, pit's getting crowded, might want to find a spot along the fence. We do not require a lawn chair. Suit yourself. Randy flipped his mask back down and returned to his weld, unbothered, because 5 large figures standing quietly nearby ranked, on his personal scale of pit distractions, somewhere below the raccoon incident, and well below the time his own brother had tried to enter the Derby driving their mother's minivan without telling her first. Karsk's team stood at the edge of the pit for several minutes, weapons lowered, entirely unsure what to do with a population that had responded to armed intruders with an offer of seating, until a tow truck operator backing a wrecked vehicle out of the staging lane clipped the edge of their formation, sending 2 soldiers stumbling sideways into a stack of spare tires, which toppled over, which prompted a chorus of good-natured heckling from nearby pit crews, who assumed the whole thing was some kind of staged pre-show bit, and began filming it on their phones. Karsk's team stood at the edge of the pit for several minutes, weapons lowered, entirely unsure what to do with a population that had responded to armed intruders with an offer of seating, until a tow truck operator backing a wrecked vehicle out of the staging lane clipped the edge of their formation, sending 2 soldiers stumbling sideways into a stack of spare tires, which toppled over, which prompted a chorus of good-natured heckling from nearby pit crews, who assumed the whole thing was some kind of staged pre-show bit, and began filming it on their phones. One of those phones belonged to a teenager named Kaylee Munn, 17 years old, there with her father's pit crew for the third season running, who uploaded a 15-second clip of two dudes in some kind of alien costume, getting knocked into a tire pile. Captioned, "The promo guys really said, we'll figure it out tonight," and went back to helping her dad check tire pressure without giving it another thought. The clip picked up 900 views over the following month, mostly from people local to the fairground circuit who assumed, correctly by every explanation available to them, that it was exactly what it looked like. An overcommitted sponsor bit that had gone sideways in front of an unimpressed crowd of people who had seen far stranger things happen in that pit over the years. Vice Marshal Ellick watched this footage arrive in fragments, each new clip somehow stranger than the last, and made, for the first time in 900 successful campaigns, the decision his species had never once needed to make before. That the target could not be secured, not because of any weapon the humans possessed, but because the event itself functioned as a kind of environment so saturated with chaos, noise, collision, and improvisation that it had developed a complete institutional immunity to the specific brand of shock, and all his entire military doctrine had been built around. He reviewed one final report before committing to a larger push. The soldier from Torvin's original team, still holding a paper tray of funnel cake near the concession trailer, had finally been located by a track official and gently walked back toward the infield fence, the tray still balanced carefully in both hands because he had, after extensive internal deliberation, concluded that returning it empty would be the more diplomatically sound choice. Ellick stared at the image for a long moment. One of his soldiers, decorated across 900 worlds, standing at a fairground fence line holding a paper tray of fried dough with what his own armor's internal sensors registered as genuine reluctance to let it go, and felt the specific, mounting unease of a commander beginning to understand that his target population's default response to confusion was not fear, but feeding. He ordered a final, larger push at the start of the feature event itself, reasoning that the largest gathering of vehicles in the largest, most chaotic heat of the night would offer either total victory or undeniable proof that this world was simply unconquerable through conventional means. It was, in the end, both. 16 soldiers under Ellick's own direct command dropped into the infield just as the feature event's opening horn sounded, 40 cars simultaneously lurching into motion around them in the largest, loudest, most violently chaotic heat of the entire evening. Chuck's voice rolled across the PA, unbothered as ever, narrating the launch of 40 vehicles into controlled mayhem, and somewhere in the middle of that dirt oval, 16 of the most decorated soldiers in the Korathi expansion fleet found themselves standing in the exact center of the single most concentrated demolition event the fair ground had run all season. What followed lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds, according to the official heat clock, and would later be described by every soldier present in independently filed reports, using variations of the same phrase. They did not fight anyone. They were simply, repeatedly, incorporated into a sport that had no category for combatant and only one category for anything standing in the infield during an active heat, which was obstacle. Ellick himself was struck twice, once by a station wagon driven by a grandmother named Loretta Sims, who had been competing in derbies since before some of his soldiers were commissioned, and once by Denny Vasco's number 22 car, making its second unintentional contact with the invasion force of the evening, a fact Denny would not learn until weeks later when a very strange video began circulating online. He rolled through the mud, armor scraped, dignity considerably more damaged than his body, and looked up just in time to see Chuck's voiceover booming across the PA. And that's a hit on the promotional guy, folks. Somebody's definitely filing a claim on Monday. Loretta Sims, 72 years old, competing in what she told anyone who asked all season was probably my last one, for real this time, a claim she made every year and had yet to honor, felt the impact against her station wagon's front bumper, glanced in her rearview mirror, and hollered out her cracked window to nobody in particular. "Sorry, hun, you're in the way," already scanning the infield for her next target before the sentence was finished. She would later tell her grandchildren, with total sincerity, that she'd clipped one of the alien fellas that night, a claim they assumed for years was simply Grandma Loretta's dry sense of humor, right up until the footage eventually surfaced online and put the matter to rest in her favor. By the time the horn sounded to end the heat, every soldier in the infield had been struck at least once, none seriously injured, all of them thoroughly, comprehensively removed from any semblance of tactical formation, scattered across the mud like the wreckage of the cars around them, several of them now genuinely indistinguishable, at a glance, from the actual demolished vehicles they were lying beside. Track officials swept the infield as they always did, cheerfully directing 16 large armored figures toward the exit gate along with the drivers whose cars had been declared unfit to continue. And the crowd, having just watched what they assumed was the most elaborate promotional stunt in the fairground's history, gave the departing figures a standing ovation as they were escorted off the track, an ovation that Alec would later describe, in his own personal log, as the single most confusing moment of an already thoroughly confusing operation. He ordered the full withdrawal at 10:15. It was not called a retreat in his official report. It was called, and he was very particular about the exact phrasing, tactical disengagement following unanticipated integration into a civilian entertainment protocol. The shuttle lifted off just as the feature event's final heat reached its conclusion, a single battered car limping across the infield to the sound of the crowd's applause. And if anyone in that grandstand noticed a departing spacecraft rising into the night sky beyond the light towers, they assumed it was part of the fireworks display scheduled to close out the evening, because by that point in the night, absolutely nothing would have surprised them either. Denny Vasco finished the night in third place, celebrated with her pit crew over gas station beer, and mentioned in passing to her husband that some promotional guy in a really committed costume had gotten in her way twice, a detail she found only mildly interesting compared to her actual placement. Chuck Doss wrapped his broadcast exactly on schedule, thanked the sponsors, and drove home without giving the strange gray figures a second thought, filing the whole encounter mentally alongside the mattress store mascot and a handful of other odd promotional stunts he'd narrated over 3 decades without ever needing an explanation for any of them. Pete Willoughby told the story of walking the promotional guys off the track to a few of the other volunteers over the following weeks, mostly as an example of how elaborate the sponsor gimmicks had gotten that season, and nobody thought to question it further, because elaborate gimmicks were, if anything, exactly what everyone had come to expect. Hollis Grant, closing out his final incident log of the night, wrote a single line about the booth encounter, costumed promo staff redirected from restricted area, no incident, filed it alongside 3 decades of similarly brief notes, and drove home thinking mostly about whether the goat from 2 seasons back had ever found its way back to its actual owner, a mystery that had occupied considerably more of his attention over the years than 4 polite strangers in elaborate armor ever would. Randy Oduya kept a photo, taken by a pit crew friend of himself, standing beside one of the soldiers near his car, both of them lit by the orange glow of his welding torch, and used it for years afterward as his standard answer whenever anyone asked what the strangest thing was he'd ever seen at a derby, a story that got slightly stranger with each retelling, and was, in its unembellished original form, already strange enough that nobody ever doubted it. Fran Ostrowski never learned exactly who she'd handed that packet of aspirin to, filing the memory generically alongside 3 decades of similar encounters with dazed drivers and overheated fans, though she did mention to a fellow volunteer the following week that the sponsor costumes had gotten unreasonably realistic that season, a complaint that went nowhere in particular, because nobody at the fairground had any authority over sponsor decisions anyway. Kaylee Munn's video sat quietly online for years, occasionally rediscovered by strangers scrolling through old Derby footage, most of whom left comments guessing at the costume budget rather than the truth, which none of them were ever remotely close to guessing. Marion Cade's photographs ran exactly once, on page 14 of a weekly insert nobody outside the county ever read, and were never referenced again by anyone at the paper, filed away in a digital archive alongside 3 decades of similarly unremarkable community photography, indistinguishable from 1,000 other frames of local color nobody had ever thought twice about. Vice Marshal Alec Dre filed his report to the Korathi Expansion Fleet High Command later that week. It was short and unusually honest for a commander not generally inclined toward admitting failure. Recommendation, he wrote. Do not engage any population gathered around deliberate sanctioned vehicular collision as entertainment. The target environment does not distinguish between hostile incursion and ordinary event debris, and processes both identically, as something to be cleared, redirected, or, in several confirmed cases, simply driven through without pause. We were not defeated by weapons. We encountered no organized defense of any kind. We were absorbed into the structure of the event itself, treated by turns as promotional talent, misplaced equipment, an obstacle indistinguishable from the wreckage already scattered across the field, and in one instance, a guest deserving of complimentary food. The High Command read the report twice, marked the coordinates for permanent avoidance, and added, beneath Alec's recommendation, a line that would be quoted in Korathi training academies for the next 100 years. Never land in a place that has already built its entire culture around the celebration of collision. They will not fight you. They will simply run whatever you brought, count it as a hit, and offer you a snack afterward. Squad leader Torvin Kess was quietly reassigned to a training post the following season, where he opened every lecture with the same warning, delivered in a voice that had never quite lost the flat disbelief of that first impact. Before you land anywhere on this planet, confirm there is no scheduled event. If there is a scheduled event, assume you are part of it. Vray kept, tucked into his personal effects, a laminated general admission ticket that Hollies had pressed into his hand on the walk down from the booth, insisting he take it for next time. A gesture Vray never fully understood but never discarded either. The soldier who had accepted the funnel cake was quietly relieved of forward deployment duty for the remainder of the campaign season, a decision his file attributed to unresolved attachment to a civilian food item, a diagnosis category that had never existed before and would, as far as the fleet's medical corps could determine, likely never be needed again. Rel, still troubled months later by the specific memory of being driven through by a teenager, requested and received a formal transfer to orbital logistics work, citing in his transfer request a professional preference for assignments that do not require standing in open terrain during scheduled civilian events, a request his superiors approved without further comment, having by then reviewed enough of the engagement footage themselves to understand exactly what he meant. Puvash, for his part, spent the weeks following the withdrawal compiling what would become, unofficially, the most thoroughly cited internal document in the fleet's recent history. A full behavioral analysis of the target population's tendency to treat any unfamiliar object entering a sanctioned chaos event as either debris, talent, or a guest, with no fourth category ever observed. He proposed, only half seriously, that future survey missions include a standing question on any candidate world. Does this population hold scheduled events built around deliberate destruction, and if so, do not land near them under any circumstances? The proposal was filed, reviewed, and quietly adopted as standard doctrine within the year, cited in at least 2 subsequent campaigns that were redirected away from targets flagged, after the fact, as hosting something the survey data could only classify as a fair. If you made it this far, drop a comment telling me the worst car you'd bring to a derby if you had the chance. Smash that like button Subscribe if you want more of these, and share this with a friend who still swears they saw something weird at the fairground a few years back. See you in the next one.